Hello, happy Tuesday, everyone. Sorry, I don't think this, there we go, better. Welcome back to Quarantine Story Time, Reading Aloud, a little book you may have heard of, War and Peace by Leo Tolstoy. Running out of funny, War and Peace, giant epic book jokes. Anyways, if anyone's got any good jokes about how long War and Peace is, please feel to drop them, send them, comment to me. I could always use some fresh, dad jokes. This is by Leo Tolstoy. This particular translation is by Richard Pevear and Larissa Volokhonsky. And we are on sections, so still volume 1, part 1, but we'll be doing section 15, 16, and 17 today. And still dealing with Anna Mikhailovna trying to get her father's godson, Count Kirill, who's dying, to give some money to her godson his godson, for his outfitting to go to the army. So, and her son, Boris, who's totally against this sort of asking favors of rich, distant, not real relatives, kind of put off by the whole thing. And he chats with Pierre and is very upfront about how he doesn't want anything from Pierre's father. Pierre has been exiled to his room because of his bad behavior and hasn't gotten to see his father since he's come to Moscow from Petersburg. And he hasn't really done much about it, and his dad's just sort of sick and dying. And then when they get back to the Rostovs, Boris and Anna Mikhailovna, the Countess has gotten money from her husband to give to her friend so that she can get Boris set up, so that Boris can, he has to buy his uniform and kit and whatever before he can take his orders in the military. So she just gave her the money, and they're crying, tearful amongst friends for the help. So I believe we are still at the Rostovs, and they're having that dinner party later the evening for their name day celebration. And Pierre has been invited, so we'll see if he shows up, how he behaves. And like I said, it's going to get hard for me to recap who everyone is and what's been going on. So if you haven't read War and Peace before, been here before, check out my channel. There's a playlist, a War and Peace playlist with all the other chapters in it so far. So you can always do that. And otherwise, just enjoy whatever you tune in for. And if this is your first time, welcome and thank you. All right. Let's just jump in, shall we? Countess Rostov, with her daughters and an already large number of guests, was sitting in the drawing room. The Count had led the male guests to his study to offer them his prized collection of Turkish pipes. From time to time, he came out and asked whether she had come yet. They were expecting Marya Dmitrievna Akrosimov, known in society as Le Terrible Dragon, a lady famous neither for her wealth nor for her rank, but for her directness of mind and frank simplicity of manners. Marya Dmitrievna was known to the Tsar's family and was known to all of Moscow and all Petersburg, and both cities, astonished at her, chuckled secretly at her rudeness and told anecdotes about her. Nevertheless, everyone without exception respected and feared her. Oh, hey! My mom just joined. Hey, Mom. We just got started. So, back in. Oh, and if, like I said yesterday, if anyone, I have the live chat up, so if anyone has any questions or comments, feel free to drop in there, and I'll try to take a peek every now and again. All right, sorry, back in the story. In the smoke-filled study, the conversation turned to the war, which had been declared in the manifesto, and to recruitment. No one had read the manifesto yet, but everyone knew of its appearance. The Count sat on an ottoman between two smoking and talking neighbors. The Count himself neither smoked nor talked, but inclining his head now to one side, now to the other, looked with obvious pleasure at the smokers and listened to the conversation of his two neighbors, whom he had set on each other. One of the talkers was a civilian with a wrinkled, bilious, gaunt, and clean-shaven face. A man approaching old age, though dressed like a most fashionable young man. He sat with his feet on the ottoman, looking like a familiar of the house, the amber bit deep in the shade of his mouth, impetuously sucking in smoke and squinting. This was the old bachelor Shinshin, the countess's cousin, a wicked tongue, as the talk went in Moscow drawing rooms. He seemed to be condescending to his interlocutor. The other, a fresh pink officer of the guards, impeccably scrubbed, combed, and buttoned up, held the amber bit in the middle of his mouth and drew the smoke in lightly with his pink lips, letting it out of his handsome mouth in rings. This was that Lieutenant Berg, an officer of the Semyonskiv regiment, with whom Boris was going off to join the regiment, and whom Natasha, teasing Vera, her older sister, called her fiancé. The Count sat between them and listened attentively. For the Count, the most agreeable occupation, apart from the game of Boston, which he liked very much, was the position of listener, especially when he managed to set two garrulous interlocutors on each other. Well, what then, old boy? Mon très honorable Alphonse Karlich, said Shinshin, chuckling and combining, which was a peculiarity of his speech, the simplest popular Russian expressions with refined French phrases. Vous comptez vous faire des rentes sur les épaules. You want to get a little something from your company? No, Pyotr Nikolaevich, I merely wish to prove, sir, that the cavalry is much less profitable than the infantry. Now look, Pyotr Nikolaevich, just consider my position. Berg always spoke very precisely, calmly, and courteously. His conversation was always concerned with himself alone. He always kept calmly quiet when the talk was about something that had no direct relation to himself, and he could be silent like that for several hours without experiencing in himself or causing in others the slightest embarrassment. But as soon as the conversation concerned him personally, he began to speak expansively and with obvious pleasure. Consider my position, Pyotr Nikolaevich. If I were in the infantry, I'd get no more than 200 rubles every 4 months, even with the rank of sub-lieutenant, which now I get 230, he said with a joyful, pleasant smile, looking at Shinshin and the Count as though it was obvious to him that his success would always constitute the chief goal of everyone else's desires. Besides that, Pyotr Nikolaevich, in transferring to the guards, I am in view, Berg went on, and vacancies in the foot guards are much more frequent. Then consider for yourselves how I am able to get along on 230 rubles. Yet I save some and also send some to my father, he went on, letting out a smoke ring. La balance est. A German can make cheese from chalk, comme dit le proverbe, said Shinshin, sifting the amber to the other side of his mouth, and winked at the Count. The Count burst out laughing. Other guests, seeing that Shinshin was conducting a conversation, came over to listen. Berg, oblivious of both the mockery and the indifference, went on to tell how he, by being transferred to the guards, was already one rank ahead of his comrades in the courts. How in wartime the company commander might be killed, and he, remaining the senior in the company, could very easily become the commander, and how everyone in the regiment liked him, and how his papa was pleased with him. Berg apparently enjoyed telling about it all, and seemed not to suspect that other people might also have their interests. But everything he told about was so nice, so earnest, the naivete of his youthful egoism was so obvious that his listeners were disarmed. Well, old boy, infantry or cavalry, you'll make it anywhere, that I prophesy to you, said Shinshin, patting him on the shoulder and lowering his feet from the ottoman. Berg smiled joyfully. The Count and his guests after him went to the drawing room. It was that time before a formal dinner, when the assembled guests refrained from beginning a long conversation, expecting to be called to the hors d'oeuvres, but at the same time consider it necessary to move about and not be silent in order to show that they are not at all impatient to sit down at the table. The hosts keep glancing at the door and occasionally exchange glances with each other. The guests try to guess from these glances who or what they are still waiting for, an important belated relation or a dish that is not ready yet. Pierre arrived just before dinner and sat awkwardly in the middle of the drawing room, in the first armchair he happened upon, getting in everyone's way. The Countess wanted to get him to talk, but he looked around naively through his spectacles as if searching for someone, and gave monosyllabic answers to all the Countess's questions. He was an inconvenience and was the only one not to notice it. The majority of the guests, knowing his story with the bear, looked curiously at this big, fat, and placid man, wondering how such a clumsy and shy fellow could perform such a stunt with a policeman. "Did you arrive recently?" the Countess asked him. "Oui, madame," he replied, looking around. "Have you seen my husband?" "Non, madame." He smiled quite inappropriately. "It seems you were recently in Paris. I suppose it was very interesting." "Very interesting." The Countess exchanged glances with Anna Mikhailovna. Anna Mikhailovna understood that she was being asked to take up this young man, and sitting beside him, she began speaking of his father. But as with the Countess, he gave her nothing but monosyllabic answers. The guests were all taken up with each other. Les Razumovsky, car est charmant, vous êtes bien bon. La Countess Apraxine was heard on all sides. The Countess got up and went to the reception room. Marya Dmitrievna, her voice was heard from there. Herself, a rough female voice, was heard in reply, after which Marya Dmitrievna came into the room. All the girls, and even the ladies, except for the oldest ones, rose. Marya Dmitrievna stood in the doorway, and from the height of her corpulent body, her 50-year-old head with its gray curled hair held high, looked over the guests, and unhurriedly straightened the wide sleeves of her dress as if pushing them up. Marya Dmitrievna always spoke in Russian. "Congratulations to the dear name-day lady and her children," she said in her loud, dense voice, which overwhelmed all other noises. "And you old sinner," she turned to the Count, who was kissing her hand. "I bet you're bored in Moscow. No chasing about this with dogs here? Nothing to be done, old boy. Look at how these birdies are growing up." She pointed to the girls. "Like it or not, you'll have to hunt for suitors." "Well, how's my Cossack?" Marya Dmitrievna called Natasha a Cossack. She said, caressing Natasha, who came up to kiss her hand fearlessly and merrily. "I know she's a wicked girl, but I love her." She took from her enormous reticule a pair of pear-shaped ruby earrings, and having given them to the festively radiant and red-cheeked Natasha, turned away at once and addressed Pierre. "Yeah, my gallant, come here to me," she said in a falsely quiet and high voice. "Come here to me, my gallant." And she menacingly pushed up her sleeves still higher. Pierre approached, gazing at her naively through his spectacles. Come on, my gallant. I was the only one to tell your father the truth when chance smiled on him. And to you too, God willing." She paused. Everyone fell silent, waiting for what would happen and feeling that this was only the preface. A fine one, to say the least, a fine lad. His father's lying on his deathbed and he's having fun, sitting a policeman on the back of a bear. Shame on you, old boy, shame on you. You'd do better to go to the war. She turned away and offered her arm to the Count, who could barely keep from laughing. "Well, so I suppose it's to the table?" said Marya Dmitrievna. The Count was first with Marya Dmitrievna. Then came the Countess, led by a hussar colonel, a useful man with whom Nikolai was to overtake his regiment, and Anna Mikhailovna with Shinshin. Berg offered his arm to Vera. The smiling Julie Kerrigan went to the table with Nikolai. After them came other couples, stretching the whole length of the room, and behind them all the children, tutors and governesses came singly. Servants bustled about, chairs scraped, music began playing in the gallery, and guests seated themselves. The sounds of the Count's household music was replaced by the sounds of knives and forks, the talk of guests, the soft footsteps of the servants. At the head of the table, at one end, sat the Countess. To her right, Marya Dmitrievna, and to her left, Anna Mikhailovna and the other ladies. At the other end sat the Count. To his left, the hussar colonel. To his right, Shinshin and the other male guests. One side of the long table was occupied by the older young people. Vera sat next to Berg, Pierre next to Boris. On the other side were the children, tutors and governesses. From behind the crystal, the bottles, and the bowls of fruit, the Count kept glancing at his wife and her tall cap with blue ribbons, and diligently poured wine for his neighbors, not forgetting himself. The Countess, too, from behind the pineapples, never forgetting her duties as hostess, cast meaningful glances at her husband, the redness of whose face and bald head, it seemed to her, contrasted sharply with his gray hair. At the ladies' end, a steady chatter went on. At the men's, louder and louder voices could be heard, especially that of the hussar colonel, who ate and drank so much, growing redder and redder, that the Count now set him as an example to the other guests. Berg was saying to Vera with a tender smile that love was a heavenly, not an earthly feeling. Boris was naming the guests at the table for his new friend Pierre, while exchanging glances with Natasha, who was sitting across from him. Pierre spoke little, looked at the new faces, and ate a lot. Starting with the 2 soups, of which he chose à la tortue, and the savory pie, right up to the hazel grouse, he did not skip a single dish or a single wine, which the butler mysteriously displayed for him behind his neighbor's shoulder, the bottle wrapped in a napkin murmuring dry Madeira, or Hungarian, or Rhine wine. Of the 4 crystal glasses with the Count's monogram that stood before each place, he would hold out the first he happened to be upon and drink with enjoyment, glancing around at the guests with a more and more pleasant air. Natasha, who was sitting across from him, gazed at Boris as a 13-year-old girl gazes at a boy she has just kissed for the first time and is in love with. She occasionally turned this same gaze to Pierre, and, under the gaze of this funny, lively girl, he wanted to laugh himself, without knowing why. Nikolai sat far away from Sonia, next to Julie Kerrigan, and again was saying something to her with an involuntary smile. Sonia smiled formally, but was clearly suffering from jealousy. She turned pale, then red, and tried as hard as she could to hear what Nikolai and Julie were saying to each other. The governess looked around anxiously, as if preparing to resist if anyone took it into his head to offend the children. The German tutor tried to memorize all the kinds of dishes and desserts and wines in order to describe everything in detail in his letter to his family in Germany, and was quite offended that the butler, with the napkin-wrapped bottle, bypassed him. The German frowned, trying to show by his look that he did not even wish to have this wine, but was offended because no one wanted to understand that the wine was necessary for him, not in order to quench his thirst, nor out of greed, but out of conscientious love of knowledge. Section 16. At the men's end of the table, the conversation was becoming more and more animated. The colonel said that the manifesto with the declaration of war had already been published in Petersburg, and that a copy, which he had seen himself, had been delivered today by messenger to the commander-in-chief. "And what the deuce makes us go to war with Bonaparte?" said Shinshin. "Il a déjà rabattu la coquette à la Autriche. La crainte cache cette fois, ce n'est pas notre tour." The colonel was a tall, stout, and sanguine German, obviously a seasoned soldier and a patriot. He took offense at Shinshin's words. "Because, my dear sir," he said, pronouncing the B as a P and the D as a T. "Because the emperor knows that. He said in the manifesto that he cannot look with indifference at the dangers that threaten Russia, and that the security of the empire, its dignity, and the sacredness of its alliances," he said, for some reason giving special emphasis to the word alliances, as if this was the essence of the matter. And with that impeccable official memory peculiar to him, he repeated the introductory words of the manifesto. "And the desire which constitutes the sole and absolute aim of the sovereign to establish a peace in Europe on firm foundations led to his present decision to move part of the army abroad and to make further efforts towards the achievement of that intention. It's because of that, my dear sir," he concluded, did it actually? Oh, that's a hard word. Didactically. Taking a glass of wine and looking to the Count for encouragement. "Connaissez-vous le proverbe, Jérôme, Jérôme, stay close to home, keep your shovel in the loam?" asked Shinshin, wincing and smiling. "C'est le nous convient à merveille. Take Suryov. Even he got beaten à plate couture. And where are our Suryovs now? Je nous demande un peu." "Je vous demande un peu," he said. constantly switching from Russian to French. "We must fight to the last drop of blood," said the colonel, pounding the table. "Und Thierry for our emperor, and then all will be well. And reason as little as possible." He especially drew out the word possible. "As little as possible," he concluded, again addressing the count. "So we old hussars see it anyway. And how do you, a young man and a young hussar, see it?" he added, turning to Nikolai, who, hearing that things had got on to the war, had abandoned his interlocutress and was looking all eyes and listening all ears to the colonel. "I agree with you completely," replied Nikolai, blushing all over, turning his plate and rearranging the glasses, and with such a determined and desperate air as though he was exposed right then to great danger. "I'm convinced that the Russians must either die or conquer," he said, aware himself, as the others were, once the word had been spoken, that it was too rapturous and pompous for the present occasion, and therefore awkward. "C'est bien beau ce que vous venez de dire," Julie, who was sitting next to him, said with a sigh. Sonia trembled all over and blushed to her ears, behind her ears, and down her neck and shoulders as Nikolai was speaking. Pierre listened to what the colonel said and nodded approvingly. "That's very nice," he said. "A real hussar, young man," replied the colonel, pounding the table again. "What's this noise about?" Maria Dmitriev's brass voice was suddenly heard all down the table. "What are you pounding the table for?" She addressed the hussar. "Why are you getting excited? Maybe you think the French are here in front of you?" "I'm speaking the truth," the hussar said, smiling. "It's all about the war," the count shouted down the table. "My son's going, Maria Dmitrievna, my son. I've got 4 sons in the army, and I'm not grieving. It's all God's will. You can die in your sleep, and God can spare you in battle." The dense voice of Maria Dmitrievna rang out effortlessly from the other end of the table. "That's so." And the conversation again became concentrated, the ladies at their end of the table and the men at theirs. "You don't dare ask," said Natasha's little brother. "You don't dare ask." "Yes, I do," replied Natasha. Her face suddenly flushed, expressing a desperate and merry resolve. She stood up, her eyes inviting Pierre, who sat across from her, to listen, and addressed her mother. "Mamma!" her throaty child's voice rang out for the whole table to hear. "What is it?" the countess asked fearfully, but seeing from her daughter's face that it was a prank, she sternly waved her hand at her, making a threatening and negative gesture with her head. The conversation hushed. "Mamma, what's for dessert?" Natasha's little voice rang out still more resolutely without faltering. The countess wanted to frown, but could not. Maria Dmitrievna shook her fat finger. "Cossack," she said menacingly. Most of the guests looked at the parents, not knowing how to take this escapade. "You're going to get it," said the countess. "Mamma, what's for dessert?" cried Natasha boldly now, and with capricious merriment, certain beforehand that her escapade would be taken well. Sonia and fat Petya hid their faces with laughter. "So I dared," Natasha whispered to her little brother and to Pierre, at whom she glanced again. "Ice cream, only you won't get any," said Maria Dmitrievna. Natasha saw that there was nothing to fear, so she was not afraid of Maria Dmitrievna either. "What kind of ice cream, Maria Dmitrievna? I don't like vanilla." "Carrot." "No, what kind, Maria Dmitrievna? What kind?" she nearly shouted. "I want to know." Maria Dmitrievna and the countess laughed, and all the guests followed suit. Everyone laughed, not at Maria Dmitrievna's reply, but at the inconceivable boldness and adroitness of this girl, who was both smart and pert enough to treat Maria Dmitrievna that way. Natasha left off only when they told her there would be pineapple ice cream. Before the ice cream, champagne was served. The music struck up again. The count kissed his dear countess, and the guests, rising, wished the countess a happy name day and clinked glasses across the table with the count, the children, and each other. Again the waiters scurried about, chairs scraped, and the guests, in the same order but with redder faces, returned to the drawing room and the count's study. Section 17. Tables were set up for Boston, parties were drawn, and the count's guests settled themselves in the 2 drawing rooms, the sitting room and the library. The count, his cards already in a fan, refrained with difficulty from his usual after-dinner nap and laughed at everything. The young people, at the Countess's urging, gathered around the clavichord and the harp. Julie was the first, at everyone's request, to play a piece with variations for the harp, and along with the other girls began asking Natasha and Nikolai, known for their musicality, to sing something. Natasha, who was addressed like a grown-up, was obviously very proud of it, but at the same time timid. "What shall we sing?" she asked. "The Spring," replied Nikolai. "Well, let's be quick about it." "Boris, come here," said Natasha. "But where's Sonia?" She looked around, and seeing that her friend was not in the room, ran to look for her. Running into Sonia's room and not finding her friend there, Natasha ran to the nursery. Sonia was not there either. Natasha realized that Sonia was in the corridor on the chest. The chest in the corridor was a place of sorrows for the young female generation of the Rostov household. Indeed, Sonia, in her airy pink dress, crushing it, was lying face down on the nanny's dirty striped feather bed on the chest, and covering her face with her fingers was sobbing, her bare little shoulders twitching. Natasha's face, animated and festive all day, suddenly changed. Her eyes stared, then her broad neck shuddered, and the corners of her mouth drooped. "Sonia, what is it? What's the matter with you? What?" And Natasha, spreading her big mouth and looking perfectly ugly, started howling like a baby, not knowing the reason why, only because Sonia was crying. Sonia wanted to raise her head and reply, but could not, and buried herself still more. Natasha wept, sitting on the blue feather bed and embracing her friend. Gathering her forces, Sonia sat up and began wiping away her tears and telling her story. "Nikolenka's leaving in a week. His papers are ready. He told me himself, but all the same, I wouldn't be crying." She held up the paper she had in her hand. It was verses written by Nikolai. "All the same, I wouldn't be crying, but you can't. Nobody can understand what a soul he has." And again she began to cry, because his soul was so good. "It's all right for you. I'm not envious. I love you, and Boris too," she said, gathering her forces a little. "He's nice. There's no obstacles for you. But Nikolai's my cousin. We need the Metropolitan himself. Even then it's impossible. And then if Mama," Sonia considered and called the Countess her mother, "she'll say that I'm ruining Nikolai's career, that I have no heart, that I'm ungrateful, and really, I swear to God," she crossed herself, "I love her and all of you so very much. Only Vera. Why, what have I done to her? I'm so grateful to you that I'd be glad to sacrifice everything I have, but I don't have anything." Sonia could not speak anymore, and again hid her head in her hands and in the feather bed. Natasha began to calm down, but it was clear from her face that she realized all the importance of her friend's grief. "Sonia," she said suddenly, as if guessing the real reason for her cousin's distress, "Vera must have talked with you after dinner. Did she?" "Yes. Nikolai himself wrote out these verses, and I wrote down some others. She found them on my desk, and she said she'd show them to Mama. And she also said that I was ungrateful, that Mama would never let him marry me, and that he'd marry Julie. You see how he's been with her the whole day. Natasha, why?" And she burst out crying more bitterly than before. Natasha pulled her up, hugged her, and smiling through her tears began to reassure her. "Sonia, don't believe her, dear heart, don't believe her. Remember how we and Nikolenka, the three of us, talked in the sitting room? Remember after supper? We decided how everything was going to be. I don't remember how anymore, but remembered how good and possible it all was? Why, Uncle Shinshin's brother married his first cousin, and we're just second cousins. And Boris said it was very possible. You know, I told him everything, and he's so intelligent and so nice." And Natasha went on saying, "So don't cry, Sonia, dearest, darling Sonia." And she kissed her, laughing. "Vera's wicked, God help her, but everything will be all right. She won't tell Mama. Nikolenka will tell her himself, and he never gave a thought to Julie." And she kissed her on the head. Sonia got up. The kitten revived. Its eyes sparkled, and it seemed ready to raise its tail at any moment, spring up on its soft paws, and play with a ball of yarn, as a kitten ought to do. "Do you really think so? Really swear to God?" she said quickly, straightening her dress and hair. "Really, swear to God," replied Natasha, straightening a strand of stiff hair that had come loose from her friend's braid. And the two girls laughed. "So let's go and sing the Spring." "Yes, let's. You know that fat Pierre who sat across from me is so funny," Natasha said suddenly, stopping. "I feel so merry." And Natasha went running down the corridor. Sonia, brushing off feathers and hiding the verses in her bosom, near her neck with its protruding collarbones. Her face flushed, went running after Natasha with light, merry steps down the corridor to the sitting room. At the request of the guests, the young people sang the quartet, The Spring, which everyone liked very much. Then Nikolai sang a song he had just learned. On a pleasant night beneath the moon, how happy it is the reverie, that in this world there still is one, whose thoughts do ever turn to thee. And as her lovely hand, which she lets wander o'er the harp's bright strings, plays in impassioned harmony, so she to thee her summons sings. 1 day, 2 days, then paradise, but ah, thy friend is cold as ice. And he had not finished singing the last words before the young people in the ballroom began preparing to dance, and the musicians began stamping their feet and coughing in the gallery. Pierre was sitting in the drawing room where Shinshin, knowing he had come from abroad, had started a boring political conversation with him, in which other people joined. When the music began to play, Natasha came into the drawing room and going straight up to Pierre, blushing and with laughing eyes, said, "Mama told me to ask you to dance." "I'm afraid I'll confuse the figures," said Pierre, "but if you'd like to be my teacher," and he lowered his fat arm, he offered it to the slender girl. When the couples were being placed and the musicians were tuning up, Pierre sat with his little partner. Natasha was perfectly happy. She was dancing with a grown-up who had come from abroad. She sat in full view of everyone and talked to him like a grown-up. In her hand was a fan which a young lady had given her to hold, and assuming a most worldly pose, God knows where and when she learned it, fanning herself and smiling through the fan, she talked with her partner. "Look at her, just look at her," said the old countess, walking through the room, pointing at Natasha. Natasha blushed and laughed. "Well, what is it, Mama? What are you getting at? What's so surprising?" In the middle of the third écossaise, the chairs began moving into the drawing room where the Count and Maria Dmitrievna were playing, and the greater part of the honored guests and old folk, stretching after sitting so long and putting their wallets and purses in their pocket, came to the door of the ballroom. At their head came Maria Dmitrievna and the Count, both with merry faces. The Count, with jocular politeness, somehow in a ballet-like fashion, offered his rounded arm to Maria Dmitrievna. He drew himself up, and his face brightened with a special, dashingly sly smile, and as soon as the last figures of the écossaise came to an end, he clapped his hands and called out to the musicians in the gallery, addressing the first fiddle. "Semyon, do you know Daniel Cooper?" That was the Count's favorite dance, which he used to dance while still in his youth. Daniel Cooper was, in fact, one of the figures of the Anglaise. "Look at Papa," Natasha shouted to the whole room, completely forgetting that she was dancing with a grown-up, bending her curly head down to her knees and dissolving into her ringing laughter for the whole ballroom to hear. Indeed, all who were in the ballroom looked with smiles of joy at the merry old man, who, beside his stately partner, Maria Dmitrievna, who was taller than he, rounded his arms, shook them in time to the music, and squared his shoulders, flexed his legs, stamped slightly, and the smile widened more and more on his round face, prepared the spectators for what was to come. As soon as the merry, provocative sounds of Daniel Cooper, resembling a rollicking tripek, rang out, all the doors of the ballroom suddenly filled with the smiling faces of the servants, the men on one side, the women on the other, who came to watch their master's merrymaking. "Look at that, look at the old dear, an eagle," the nanny said loudly from one door. The Count danced well and knew it, but his partner could not and would not dance well at all. Her enormous body stood straight, her powerful arms hung down. She had given her reticule to the Countess. Only her stern but handsome face danced. What was expressed in the whole round figure of the Count, in Maria Dmitrievna, was expressed in her ever more smiling face and ever more thrust-up nose. On the other hand, if the Count, who got himself going more and more, fascinated his spectators by his unexpectedly deft capers and the light leaps of his supple legs, Maria Dmitrievna, by the slightest exertion in moving her shoulders or rounding her arms while turning or stamping, produced no less of an impression by its merit, which everyone appreciated in view of her corpulence and perpetual severity. The dance became more and more lively. The other couples could not draw attention to themselves for a minute and did not even try to. All were taken up with the Count and Maria Dmitrievna. Natasha pulled everyone present by the sleeve or the dress, demanding that they look at Papa, though even without that, they could hardly ever take their eyes off the dancers. The Count, during the pauses in the dance, panted heavily, waved and shouted to the musicians to play faster, more and more quickly, more and more dashingly. The Count deployed himself, now on tiptoe, now on his heels, dancing around Marya Dmitrievna, and finally, returning his partner to her seat, he performed the last step, raising his supple leg behind him, bending down his sweating head with its smiling face, and waving his round right arm amidst the thunder of applause and laughter, especially from Natasha. The two dancers stopped, breathing heavily and wiping their faces with cambric handkerchiefs. That's how people danced in our time, ma chérie, said the Count. Ah, what a Daniel Cooper, said Marya Dmitrievna, letting out a long, deep breath and pushing up her sleeves. And that takes us to the end of 17. And I believe we'll save 18 for next time. So the Count and Countess clearly know how to host a party. Seems like they seem like a fun group of people to hang out with. Like, he just loves her. He's kind of a goofy dude who just kind of hangs around, and she's like happy with her children and, you know, her good friends. And then they have this like random lady who likes to speak her mind very emphatically, who's like also somehow good friends with them, and their impertinent little children just amuse her. So it seems a good mix all around. Be interesting to see what happens with Sonia and Nikolai, though. That has bodings of like a love triangle, some kind of heartbreak there. So yeah, that's we're moving right along. If anyone's curious, we're that far into it. So should be good times. Yeah, that's all for today. Stay tuned tomorrow about 3. I'm gonna try to be here right at 3 tomorrow to have more War and Peace. Thanks, everyone. Have a great day. Bye.